And here to discuss the outlook for the banking sector, we're joined by Ralph Silva, Director of Silva Research Network. Thanks very much for joining us. So I want to start by asking about BNP Paribas because they outperformed, a pretty good performance for them.
It was a great morning. Woke up this morning and I actually saw some positive news from the financial services industry, which is outstanding. BNP, SocGen, Crédit Agricole, they're all doing very well. So it's very safe to say that the French banking system has fully recovered from the problems and they're just set up for a lot of great growth.
And with BNP Paribas in particular, you were telling me that this is because of their diversified model.
Sure, I've always been pretty positive on BNP because they sort of follow the same principles as HSBC, and that is there's safety in diversification, and that's exactly what BNP is all about. And these results illustrate that. All their retail banking success has been actually out of the Benelux, not out of France. We're still seeing some weakness in French retail banking, but also we've seen a lot of strength in corporate investment banking, which represents about 50% of the revenue now, which is probably not the healthiest of states, but nevertheless, it's actually showed them a lot of profitability. So this is a sign that we don't want to have the banks smaller. We actually want more diversification instead of actually reducing the size of the banks.
Now, Société Générale also reported positive numbers. I mean, is this an indication that French banking industry has, in fact, turned a corner?
It has turned a corner and is doing extremely well. We still need more strength in retail banking. There's no question about that. But Société Générale, as well as Crédit Agricole, the problem there is really their exposure in Greece. They have significant exposures in there, and if there's any problems or if there's additional problems with that, that could cause some issues. But of course, BNP Paribas doesn't have as much of an exposure in Greece, so they're not it's not as dangerous for them, but they do have a big exposure in Spain and Portugal, so that could still come back and bite them.
Exactly. It's interesting that these positive numbers are taking place against the backdrop of sovereign risk in Europe and the threat of contagion. Are the companies and the financial institutions who have reported healthy earnings going to be able to sustain the momentum throughout the course of the year?
Yeah, the direct loss, even if they lost everything in Greece or any of the French banks, or for that matter, any of the European banks, is not that significant. But the problem is we could be going into what I call the perfect storm. We have a problem in Greece, which will get worse before it gets better. If we have a similar problem in Spain and or Portugal, and if we have a hung parliament in the UK and we don't have a coalition within a few weeks, then all economic models are off. We just don't know what's going to happen. And that's the real risk of what we're going into. But on the positive side, it's all about the summer. We need the summer to get everybody happy. Once we get more positive attitude in the retail community, then all the banks should actually end the year fairly positively.
And it's French and German banks that are facing the greatest exposure to the debt crisis in Greece.
By and large, yes, it's those two countries. But it's the UK banks also have exposure. There are some Italian banks, and of course some Asian banks also have exposure. Everybody's exposed into Greece.
And what does that potentially mean should Europe go into a double-dip recession? How are these banks strategically placed to deal with that?
Right, and that's the issue, is that the top banks in Europe, so BNP would be one of those, HSBCs, it's not a big problem because the exposure in there they can easily deal with. But it's the smaller banks that are very much on the cusp, the government-owned organizations around the globe that are invested in Greece. Those are the ones that we have biggest problem with. We actually expect there's going to be another round of financing for those banks, up to about $300 billion in more capitalization for the banks. That'll happen between here and the end of the year. But it won't be the top tier banks, it'll be the second tier of banks that are currently having problems.
Thank you so much for joining us. We do appreciate it. Ralph Silva.